The girl who had lived quietly all her life suddenly married a cold, aloof CEO under her sister's name, but on their wedding night, he noticed something. The eyes. They weren't the same as in the photo. Can kindness mend the fracture of a lie? And this is how it all began. The bridal dressing room was unnervingly quiet, a stark contrast to the grand celebration unfolding downstairs. Everything here was perfect, too perfect. Like a film scene where everyone knew their lines except her, the woman in front of the mirror, Elena Dawson, sat utterly still. The pristine white gown wrapped around her like it belonged, yet she couldn't recognize the reflection staring back. Beside her, a white envelope with gold trim lay untouched, handwritten across the front, "For the bride." Not for her. And she hadn't opened it. Sunlight filtered through the window, striping the floor like judgment. In just a few minutes, she would walk out and marry Jonathan Reed, a man she'd never met in person, at least not as herself, 12 hours earlier. "Elena, I can't do it. I'm not ready. I love someone else." Claire's voice cracked. Her veil slid to the floor and mascara smudged. Panic in every breath, Elena stood frozen. Her twin sister, always poised, always the strong one, was unraveling before her like a child. "Claire, this wedding isn't just about you. It's tied to the family, to Dad's company. If this merger falls apart, everything collapses," Elena said, voice tight, controlled. Claire clutched her hand, eyes pleading. "Please, we're identical. He's barely seen me off Zoom. Just one day. Get through the ceremony, sign the papers. I'll fix it afterward. Don't let everything fall apart because of me." Silence. Elena didn't say yes, but the next morning, she wore Claire's wedding gown. And the answer became clear. Now, back in the present, Elena exhaled slowly, her eyes locked on the woman in the mirror, someone between herself and Claire. A version of her that didn't quite belong to either. A knock at the door. "Miss Claire." "It's time," called the coordinator gently from the hallway. Elena rose, nodded. The envelope remained unopened. The wedding hall glowed beneath golden chandeliers. 100 guests looked on. Business moguls, media figures, family friends. No one questioned the bride walking down the aisle, arm linked with her father's. No one knew this was Elena Dawson, not Claire. As she approached, Jonathan Reed looked up. For a fraction of a second, his expression shifted. Doubt? She lowered her eyes. Vows were exchanged. Rings slid onto fingers. Applause erupted. The photographer caught the tremble in her hand as she touched his. The reception was a blur, champagne, congratulations, and perfectly practiced smiles. Helena kept her answers brief, steering away from anything personal. No one noticed. Or maybe they chose not to. That night, in the luxury suite prepared for their honeymoon, Jonathan loosened his tie and stepped into the room. Elena stood at the window, watching the city lights flicker. "You were quiet today," Jonathan said. "Not quite a question." "Weddings are a lot," she replied. He moved toward the table, spotted the envelope. "For the bride." "You haven't opened it?" he asked. She hesitated. "I forgot." He picked it up, felt its weight, then set it back down. "You don't seem like someone who forgets." Her pulse spiked. "You're not what I expected," Jonathan continued. "Your emails were sharper. Today you're different." She turned, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not afraid." Pause. "I'm not Claire." The room went still. Jonathan studied her. No anger, no outrage. Just quiet consideration. "I know," he said. Elena blinked. "You know? From the moment you walked down the aisle, why didn't you say anything? I wanted to see how long you'd pretend, but you didn't." He met her eyes. "You told me." She stepped forward, picked up the envelope, and finally opened it. Inside, Claire's rushed handwriting. "Thank you. You saved me. I promise I'll fix this." Tears welled in Elena's eyes. She turned. "I didn't mean to trick you." "I know," Jonathan said softly. "So, what now?" He was quiet for a moment. "We start with the truth tomorrow." She nodded. That night they sat at opposite ends of the room. No words. No touches, but something new began to take shape. Not love, not resentment, something quieter. The fragile possibility of being seen, even if it began with pretending. If a story begins with a lie, can it still end in truth? Jonathan's hand rested lightly on Elena's shoulder, a gesture that should have been tender, instinctive, something fitting for a newlywed husband. But the touch carried weight, not warmth. His eyes didn't settle on her. They looked through her, as if trying to find the outline of a truth that had slipped past. Then he turned and walked away. Elena remained where she was, fingers tightening gently on the hem of the gown. She breathed deeply. When the lights in the room dimmed to a muted gold, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small photograph, snapped in a quiet moment the day before. It was a quick shot of her and Claire, standing together in the bridal suite. One moment, one click. But the decision behind it had changed her entire life. She looked at their eyes in the picture, identical, and yet behind them, two entirely different women. That day, Claire had curled herself into the corner of the bed, barefoot, clinging to a pillow. The wedding dress still hung nearby, no longer a dream, but a burden. Eleanor stood across from her, one hand gripping the doorframe as if to anchor her resolve. "He doesn't know me, Claire," I said, breathless. "He doesn't know what I like, what I hate, that I can't stand strawberries." She laughed, a sharp, splintered sound. "He's not marrying me. He's marrying the name Claire Dawson and the company behind it," Elena said. Nothing, because she already knew. "But if I run," she whispered, "Dad loses his shares. Mom can't co-sign for Grandma's treatment. They'll say the Dawson daughter ran because she was scared of being rich." Claire grabbed her hand, pleading. "You and I, we're the same. He's barely seen me in person. Just wear the dress, walk the aisle. I swear no one will know, not even him." "And what about me?" Eleanor had asked. "What happens to me?" "I'll come back," Claire promised. "I just need time. One day." Eleanor could have said no. She should have said no, but she said nothing. And by the time she slipped into Claire's gown the next morning, when everything was pressed and waiting and no one had time to notice, one daughter had disappeared. Her silence had already sealed the decision. She'd asked the stylist to take that photo. "For memories," she'd said. Say a quiet farewell to the version of herself that wouldn't walk out of that room. Now, in the cold quiet of the honeymoon suite, she stared at the photo and wondered why she hadn't said anything. Why no one ever asked. She remembered the family meeting. No one mentioned how the daughters felt. They talked mergers, stock prices, press coverage. Her father had laid the contract in front of Claire and said, "Sign and everything's secure." Elena had wanted to interrupt, wanted to ask, "And what about Claire's heart?" But she didn't, because Claire didn't. And sometimes, silence is easier than bravery. She blinked as the sound of running water stopped. Jonathan stepped out of the bathroom, shirt unbuttoned, hair damp. He glanced at the photo in her hand. "Eleanor," he said, calling her name for the first time. Her heart stuttered. "You knew?" she whispered. "I guessed yesterday," he said calmly. "Now I'm sure," she couldn't breathe. "I didn't mean to deceive you. I just..." Jonathan looked at her. His eyes weren't cruel, but they weren't soft either. "You chose silence." Her lips parted. Her eyes brimmed. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If I'd spoken then, how everything would have fallen apart. I would have hurt my parents, destroyed everything they worked for." Jonathan nodded, but said nothing. He walked out, leaving her alone in the golden hush, holding a photo still warm from her hand. On the back, Claire had scrawled a rushed note. "I believe in you. You're always the one who keeps things together." Elena pressed a hand to her heart, whispering, "I wasn't silent. I just didn't have the courage." Then, because some silences aren't born of deception, they come from knowing that a single word might shatter everything you love. The silence inside the penthouse was never peaceful. It was the kind that settled between two people like a drawn curtain, neither threatening nor warm, simply absent. Elena's mornings passed quietly, brewing tea, rearranging the bookshelves, tending to the rooftop garden. She moved through the days as if trying not to leave a trace. Jonathan didn't disturb the rhythm. He left early, came home late. Their conversations were functional at best, distant at worst. Two strangers sharing walls, not a marriage. No. One mentioned the wedding night. No one said Claire's name, until a Tuesday afternoon. While sorting clothes in the sitting room closet, Eleanor accidentally dropped a small square of fabric, a teal silk scarf. She froze. Claire's birthday gift, from Jonathan days before the wedding. Elena picked it up, fingertips grazing the soft material. She remembered Claire's voice, amused and slightly mocking. Nice scarf, clearly picked by his assistant. Eleanor folded it neatly, returning it to the drawer where it didn't belong. But that evening, when she walked into the dining room, Jonathan was already seated, holding the scarf. "You dropped this," he said, not looking at her. She paused, heart leaping. "I was just organizing," she replied, steadying her voice. Jonathan let out a dry chuckle, the kind that hovered between disbelief and weariness. "I thought you didn't like silk scarves." Her eyes lifted, just slightly too slow. "Claire said that," Jonathan continued, gaze finally landing on her. "I remember." Elena's grip tightened on the back of a chair. "People change," she said, aiming for breezy but missing. Or, "Maybe you never said it in the first place." The words were soft, casual, but they landed like a stone on still water. Jonathan placed the scarf gently on the table and left for the kitchen. Elena stood frozen. Then, almost defensively, she walked forward, folded the scarf again, precise, controlled, but her hands were trembling. When she looked up, she saw herself in the tall mirror across the room. Her eyes betrayed her, panic rippling beneath. The calm. In the days that followed, Jonathan's demeanor shifted, not confrontational, but watchful. He asked odd, seemingly innocent things. "You still like blueberry tarts like in your emails? You're a pianist, right? Claire said you were exceptional, but I've never heard you touch the keys." She dodged, smiled, deflected. "Sometimes we say things just to match the person we're speaking to, don't we?" Jonathan said nothing, but his silences were becoming sharper. One evening he lingered as she watered lavender on the rooftop. "You once said burgundy was your favorite color," he noted. "But lately, you only wear green." Elena didn't respond. She stared at the flowers. She remembered. Claire despised burgundy. She loved it, but had never dared show it. That night, sleep eluded her. She wandered through the hallway, stopping at the door to Jonathan's office. It was ajar. He sat alone under the glow of his desk lamp, brows furrowed in unreadable thought. She stepped inside quietly. "Elena," he said clearly, deliberately. The second time he'd used her name without hesitation. Her breath caught. "How long?" she asked. "Have you known?" He looked up, eyes tired but not cruel. "Since the wedding," he said. "Not your face, your eyes." She looked away. Jonathan stood, his voice lower now. "So, do you have the courage to tell me yet?" Silence stretched, thick across the room. Elena didn't speak, but her tears did. They fell slow and deliberate, pooling at her feet. Each drop a weight carried since the day she stepped into a dress that was never hers. Jonathan didn't reach for her, didn't offer comfort. He only sighed and passed her by, pausing just long enough to say, "I'll wait, but not forever." When he was gone, Eleanor remained. She looked around the room, at the piano untouched, the books unopened, the wedding photo hanging too far away. She walked to his desk, picked up the scarf, folded it carefully, tucked it into a small envelope, and for the first time signed her own name, Elena Dawson. She sealed it, but she didn't leave. She stayed, sitting still in the same silence she once used as armor, because not all confrontations require shouting. Sometimes a single look, unflinching, quietly true, is all it takes to make the first crack in a leaf appear. Elena placed the teal silk scarf back into Jonathan's desk drawer as quietly as she could, carefully folded, as if returning something borrowed with an apology too soft to be spoken. She wasn't sure if he'd noticed she had it, but something inside her, ancient and instinctive, whispered that he knew and was simply waiting for her to admit it. The next morning, Jonathan said nothing. He walked into the kitchen with his usual calm, poured himself coffee, opened his laptop. Eleanor cleared the dishes, her hands trembling slightly though her face stayed composed. It was an unspoken dance they both had grown used to, performing the roles, dodging the truths. But that afternoon, when she stepped into the study again, the scarf was gone from the drawer. It had been placed on the bookshelf instead. Folded, neatly set at the center, too visible, too intentional, like a message without words. Elena stood frozen, heart pounding. He knew, and he was telling her, gently, clearly, not through confrontation, but by letting her see what he saw. That evening, Jonathan came home earlier than usual. In his hands was a small pastry box, the kind she'd once ordered in their first week living together. Not Claire's favorite, not the treat his wife was known to enjoy. He set it on the table. "Thought you might like this." "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He poured her a cup of tea, oolong light, nothing like the peppermint Claire used to drink. It was the first time he served her, and the first time she felt afraid, not of being caught, but of what it meant to be seen. When there was no mask left to wear, Jonathan said nothing about the scarf, no questions, no accusations. But things began to change. The wedding portrait was moved, no longer centered above the fireplace, but set discreetly on a side table. The matching cups were separated. One night, Elena woke from a dream laced with panic and found Jonathan still awake in the dim light of the living room, reading. Beside him, the scarf, now in a small glass frame. "You keeping it as evidence?" she asked, half joking, half aching. He looked up. "No. Sometimes. The truth doesn't come through words. Sometimes it's a detail that refuses to disappear." She didn't respond. He closed his book and stood. "Are you not angry?" she asked softly. He paused, then answered with a question. "If I was the first to notice, do you think Claire would have fooled me this long?" Elena dropped her gaze. "Claire knew how to play a role," he said. "But you're so honest, you can't even lie all the way through." A long silence. Finally, Jonathan added, "Sometimes knowing means saying less." Then he left the room, leaving Elena alone with the framed scarf, not as evidence, but as something deeper than guilt. Something that bore the weight of what trust becomes when it's no longer spoken aloud. The next morning, she found a note in the kitchen. "Lunch meeting postponed. If you'd like, you can come with me to the company dinner tonight. No pressure, no assumptions, just a door left open." She looked at the note, then at the scarf, this time folded by her hand, not to return, but as a quiet thank you for his silence. That night, they attended the event together, first time as a couple. Since the wedding, the cameras flashed, the guests applauded, and no one saw anything different. To them, she was still Claire Dawson, but one man in the room looked at her differently. Jonathan, no longer with doubt, no longer studying her like a riddle, but with something closer to grace. And Elena, for the first time, felt like she wasn't pretending anymore, even if the truth hadn't been said aloud, even if all that remained between them was a single silk scarf holding everything they hadn't dared speak. Some plot twists don't arrive with thunder. They come quietly, in the moment someone stops asking questions because they already know. Jonathan had become gentle, not with questions, not with probing glances, but with actions so small, so intentional, they unraveled her more than any confrontation could. He opened the car door, spoke to her every morning, even if just about the weather. Quietly repurchased the out-of-print book she once mentioned over dinner, Elena found herself more unsettled than ever. She didn't understand why he chose kindness. She didn't feel she deserved it, never had. And the more softly he treated her, the more suffocating her sweet, well-mannered lie became. She needed to speak, not to Jonathan, to someone who wouldn't ask for reasons, someone who wouldn't measure her against her guilt. That afternoon, Elena walked into a small cafe tucked on a quiet old street, the same one where she'd waitressed in her first year of university. The space was unchanged: wooden tables, iron chairs, warm yellow lamps that softened even the worst memories. In the corner, Grace waited. An old friend. The only person outside family she still kept close. Grace stood, arms wrapping around her. "It's been forever. I figured you'd be too busy being the CEO's wife," she teased. Eleanor smiled, but her eyes were heavy. They talked casually for a while, until Grace tilted her head. "What's wrong?" Eleanor hesitated, then slowly reached into her bag and pulled out a letter, handwritten, unsealed, neat lines pressed with hesitation. "I wrote this last week," she said, "but I never sent it." Grace took the letter, but didn't unfold it. "To whom?" Elena breathed out. "Claire." And then the words came, uneven, but finally free. She told Grace everything: how Claire had vanished, how she had stepped in, married in her place, how she had intended to quietly disappear afterward. But Jonathan wasn't who she expected. He hadn't clung to the contract. He hadn't punished her. He had simply seen her. Not with his eyes, Eleanor said, voice trembling, but in the way he stayed quiet when it mattered. The way he listened without demanding answers. The way he waited for me to face myself. Grace reached across the table, held her hand, not to fix anything, just to be there. "Eleanor," she said gently, "I don't think you're living a lie. I think you're living in hope." Tears spilled over Elena's lashes. "I feel like I've done everything wrong," she whispered. "I'm not Claire. I'm not the person he married. I don't deserve any of this. But you're the one he's choosing. Every day." Silence. Then finally, Elena said what had lived inside her for too long. "I didn't do this for me, not for Claire, not for my parents. I just didn't want anyone to get hurt." Grace nodded. "And that's exactly why you don't have to carry the blame anymore." That night back home, Elena set the letter on the table. Still unsent, but she picked up a pen and wrote one last line. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry it anymore." The next day, Jonathan took her to a small company event. In the elevator, Elena turned to him, hesitant. "Why are you kind to me?" "Kind to." He didn't look at her when he answered. "Because I'm not sure I'm better than you." She didn't understand. But she didn't ask again, because in that moment, something inside her softened. Later that night, she entered their room and saw the silk scarf, still folded where it had always been, beside it a small note in Jonathan's handwriting. "I kept it, not as evidence, but because it reminds me, some things matter more than the truth. They're called reasons." Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, letter still in hand. She didn't need to send it anymore, because she had already forgiven, not to save anyone, not to hold on to anything, just to let it go. Because some forgiveness doesn't come from what others deserve, but from what we no longer want to carry inside our own hearts. Dinner unfolded in an unfamiliar quiet, not strained, not tense, just hollow. Eleanor sat across from Jonathan, her plate barely touched. He scrolled through his phone, not distracted, just absent, as if the screen gave him permission to avoid the silence between them. No talk of plans. No mention of who they'd see or what tomorrow held. Only the occasional soft clink of cutlery against porcelain, rising and vanishing into the space between their breaths. Elena glanced at him. He was reading, or pretending to, but his eyes were far away, and she knew he had understood everything long before now, and she couldn't bear it anymore, this strange grace of being forgiven without being asked why. When Jonathan stepped outside to take a call, Eleanor rose quietly. She walked into their bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out a small suitcase she had packed days ago. Just the essentials: a few clothes, her journal, and a letter she had rewritten 3 times but never dared to leave behind. She sat at the desk, unsealed the envelope, picked up her pen, and began again. "Jonathan, I know you've known that I'm not Claire, maybe from the beginning. Maybe you stayed silent because I seemed harmless. Or maybe because you were waiting for me to speak. I've tried to So many times, but every time you were kind, I felt smaller beneath the weight of what I wasn't saying, not because you were noble, but because I wasn't. Didn't choose to marry you, but I did choose to stay, not for gain, but because for the first time someone saw me, not through Claire's shadow, but as me. I can't keep living like this, not because of you, but because of me. Because I want just once to live honestly, even if the cost is leaving. I'm choosing to go, not to ask for forgiveness, but so I don't have to lie one day longer. Thank you for seeing me, even in silence. Elena, she placed the letter on Jonathan's desk, tucking it beneath the silk scarf, pressed flat, edges sharp, no longer a borrowed thing but a witness. Then she took her suitcase and walked out. No goodbye. No tears. Just the steady steps of someone leaving a home that almost felt like the beginning of something real. The next morning, Jonathan walked into his study like he always did. Coffee waiting, meeting agenda flashing on his phone. But the scarf, this time, lay beneath a letter. He read it, slowly, every line soaking into the quiet. When he finished, he didn't sit, didn't sigh. He closed his laptop, reached for his coat, and cancelled the board meeting, where he was meant to deliver the keynote. In the car, Jonathan drove without hesitation. He didn't know what he'd say, only that he needed to be where she might be. Maybe her old apartment, maybe that small public library she once called her quiet corner of the world. Not to bring her back, but to make sure she didn't leave feeling like she had to apologize for walking away. Elena sat in the library, by the window overlooking the garden. An unread book lay open in her lap, but her mind was still with the letter she'd left behind. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure if she felt lighter, but her chest didn't ache like it did yesterday. And maybe, for now, that was enough. Elsewhere in the city, a man stepped out of his car beneath the amber wash of afternoon sun. A letter folded twice sat warm in his pocket, not to accuse, not to explain, just to remember that sometimes the person who chooses to walk away is the one who is most honest. Not everyone has the courage to speak the truth, but everyone deserves to leave without lowering their head. Eleanor's apartment sat tucked in a quiet alley, hidden within the city's hum. It wasn't remarkable. Off-white walls, a few potted plants on the windowsill, abstract paintings from her college days. But here, she could breathe. Here she could take off the mask she'd worn for far too long. 3 days had passed since she left the penthouse. 3 days without a call, a message, a confrontation, and somehow that emptiness felt heavier than anger ever could. She hadn't expected Jonathan to chase after her. She knew him better than that. But somewhere deep down she'd hoped for some kind of tremor, however small, to tell her she'd mattered. That she'd stayed in his life as something real. That morning, the soft light of early winter filtered through her curtains. Elena rose early, made herself a cup of black coffee, and opened the fridge in search of something simple. She froze. Inside, a small cream-colored paper bag, no logo and no card. No note, just an ordinary bag like any other, and yet it silenced the entire room. Inside, strawberry vanilla cake. Her favorite. She had once mentioned it on a rain-soaked night, not thinking he was listening. But Jonathan had returned with it then. And now again her hands trembled as she held the bag. Someone had come, and only one person could have. He hadn't knocked, hadn't texted, hadn't said a word, just left it in her fridge. Elena sat down on the kitchen floor, still holding the bag, as if letting go might make it vanish. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from hurt, but from the quiet proof that she hadn't been forgotten. Later, she walked into the living room, and there on her desk she saw it, a new wooden frame, inside an old photo, her and Claire, 17 years old, grinning in matching volunteer shirts. A corner had been torn years ago, now mended with transparent tape, neat, careful, as if someone had tried to sew a memory back together, even if it didn't belong to them. No letter, no gift, no bouquet, just 2 quiet objects, and somehow they said everything. That afternoon, Elena boarded a bus to her old neighborhood, to the little cafe she'd worked at in university, the first place she'd ever felt like Elena, not Claire's sister, not Jonathan Reed's wife, just herself. She ordered her usual cinnamon tea biscotti but didn't touch them. Instead, she took out a worn journal and began to write. Not a letter, not an apology, just truths she'd never told herself. I'm not as lost as I think. Not everyone who leaves does it because they stopped loving, and not everyone who stays needs to explain why. By the time she returned home, dusk had settled. The apartment felt warmer somehow, like something inside her had been rearranged. She opened the fridge again. The cake was still there, but this time she didn't hide it away. She took out a plate, cut it carefully into slices, made tea, then played the Sunday morning jazz Jonathan used to listen to. She didn't call him, didn't hope for him to appear. She simply honored the way he'd stayed, with silence, with kindness, with small, deliberate remembrance. 3 days later, at Jonathan's office, his assistant brought him an unmarked package. Inside, the framed photo, wrapped in craft paper, and a small handwritten card. Thank you. For not asking but still choosing to stay. Jonathan traced his thumb along the taped corner of the photo. He smiled, soft, almost unseen. For the first time in days, the office felt light again. That evening, he stood outside her apartment. Didn't knock, didn't wait. Just stayed for a few moments, then turned and walked away. Not to leave her behind, but to give her space. To let her choose. Behind the curtains, Elena watched his silhouette retreat. No bitterness, no ache, only a warmth blooming in her chest, like the first spring sunlight after a long winter. And she whispered, to him or to herself, she couldn't say, "You never said you forgave me, but you never left." Because some love doesn't need declarations. Just the quiet, enduring truth that someone still chooses to stay, in their own way, in their own time. That afternoon, Elena watered her lavender pots on the balcony. The air, still damp from the rain, carried a gentle warmth, earthy, fragrant, almost forgiving. She lifted her head when she heard footsteps, soft, slow, on the wooden stairs leading up from the lower garden. Jonathan stood there. No suit, no phone, no flowers, just a small paper bag, the kind used to carry tea. Elena didn't flinch, didn't smile. She simply looked at him. He held up the bag without explanation. She tilted her head, a quiet invitation. Then turned, walked inside and brought out another chair, placed it by the little tea table in the garden. No words. Jonathan sat. She poured tea. No one mentioned the letter. No one revisited the past. They simply sat across from one another, watching the steam curl upward from their cups. A quiet ritual to mark something unnamed, yet no longer. Unfinished. My name is Mia. I'm 8 years old. I live 1 floor below Miss Elena. Most afternoons I play in the shared garden, the one with old wooden steps and the plants she takes care of herself. Every day. I see her sitting alone with tea, but today I saw 2 people, Ms. Elena, and a man I'd seen before but never heard speak. He didn't look like my dad, or like the civil servants my mom always complains about. He looked at her, not with a smile, but with something softer. She poured tea. Her hands didn't shake. I hid behind the lavender, not out of curiosity, but because I felt like if I made a sound, I'd break something sacred. Then I saw her slide a book across the table toward him. No gift wrap, no ribbon, just offered. He opened it, flipped through a few pages, then rested his hand on the cover like someone touching a story they knew by heart. I didn't hear a single word, but I'm sure they were speaking, by simply staying. The next day, I ran into Ms. Elena in the lobby. She smiled, handed me a notebook with a hard cover and said, "If you ever write stories one day, remember, not every ending needs someone to die, or someone to say sorry." I smiled back and watched her walk away, light, like wind. So this is the story I wrote, about a woman who once borrowed someone else's name to marry a stranger. But in the end, By choosing honesty, even if it cost her everything, she made that man stop. Not because she was perfect, but because she did the right thing, even when it hurt. She left. And then she returned. No one asked her to. No one waited. But he was still there. Not chasing, not demanding, just waiting. In his own quiet way. I don't know how their story ends. Maybe they'll stay together. Maybe not. But every evening, now when I look out to the garden, there are always 2 teacups, one still steaming, one always ready to be refilled. And if you've made it this far, if you've ever had to choose between what's right and what's easy, if you've ever walked away to keep your dignity, if you've ever chosen what's real, even when it came too late, leave a line. I'm still here. Not because you won, not because you never broke, but because you still believe in choosing what's kind, even when the world doesn't. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. And if something in the journey of Elena, Claire, Jonathan stayed with you, pass it on to someone else. Subscribe, not for numbers, but because none of us want to feel alone.